Well, welcome to lesson 6 in our study through the book of Esther, and we're reaching a high point in the book of Esther this week. If you are just casually familiar with the book of Esther, you're probably familiar with our memory verse, Esther 4:14. It's that famous verse about for such a time as this, and we're reaching this high point in the story where Esther is going to be faced with a choice of, is she going to be part of God's deliverance, or is she going to run away from that responsibility? So before we jump into that, we really just want to take a minute and talk about the stakes. What are the stakes right now, and what's at stake if Haman's plans succeed? And of course, the book of Esther is bigger than just our characters. It's bigger than just Haman and Mordecai and Esther. We're really talking about the promises of God. And just take a minute with your group and talk through some of those promises and what would happen if Haman's plan succeeded. You may want to talk about the seed promise way back in Genesis, about how God promised a seed would come and crush the head of the serpent, and what's going to happen to that promise if Haman's plans succeed. And of course, there's all the promises to Abraham and the Jewish nation that he would be a blessing to all the nations and they would inherit the promised land. His descendants would be more than the sand on the shore and the stars in the heavens. And what's going to happen if that nation is wiped out? What becomes of those promises? And the promises to David that there would always be a king sitting on his throne, and ultimately the promise of Jesus, the promise of a Christ, the promise of a Messiah. What's going to happen if the Jewish nation is wiped out by Haman's plan? And then, of course, we want to talk about the stakes for Esther. What happens if Esther intervenes? And it's laid out pretty clearly in the book that if she goes before the king uninvited, there is a chance that she could be put to death. And then also just think through a little bit of what happens if the king finds out she's Jewish. What if he believes Haman, that this nation really is against him and they really are not obeying his laws? And why would she hide that from the king if her true identity? What if he finds out that Esther is really Hadassah and she is Jewish? And of course, there's a risk that he could put her to death for that, or cast her out like he did Vashti. Maybe she's an embarrassment to him now. And Mordecai's advice to her is do both of those things. So as we move into this big moment in the story, it's important that we take a minute and look at Mordecai's faith. Mordecai's faith is really just a watershed moment in the story. And his answer to Esther is huge. His answer is God will deliver. God is going to keep his promises. If it's not through you, he'll do it through another way. God is going to keep his promises. And it's this important thing that's going to reveal itself more and more through the story, that God is at work and he is going to do what he says he's going to do, and he's going to keep his promises. But then there's also this advice that he gives to Esther that you should be a part of it. And if you think about all that God has been doing in Esther's life, and we think about those lessons where we talked about Esther being granted favor and how she was exalted to this place of queen, well, don't you think God had a hand in that, Esther? And don't you think maybe there's a reason that you were put in the place that you were put? And so his advice to her is just full of faith. And as good as his advice is, Esther's reply is just as good. Esther's reply is humble and is just this wonderful moment where we can learn a lot about how God wants to use us. But before we get to that, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let's talk through with your group about some of those possible reactions that Esther could have had. Put yourself in Esther's shoes as best you can. How would you react to this? And I listed a few in the outline. I mean, of course, there's always the chance that you could say no way, or you could kind of pull a Moses and say, well, I'm not qualified for this. I'm not good with talking, or clearly there's somebody better than me to do this job. Or you could have the opposite reaction and be like, I got this. I'm the queen. I won this beauty contest. I got this, no problem at all. And Esther's reaction is so much better than any of those things. It is this beautiful and humble reaction to the words of Mordecai and the plan that God is unfolding. And I love what she does first. the very first thing that she does is she turns to the people of God and she asks them to pray and she asks them to fast. She asks them to go to God and to seek him. And then she does the same thing herself. She turns to God herself and she fasts and she seeks his face. And then after she's done both of those things, she obeys. She goes before the king. She risks it all. And so Esther is this wonderful picture of the words of Jesus that whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. That's a hard verse to understand about losing your life to find it. But in Esther, we really see it crystal clear that she is willing to lay everything down to obey the plan of God. She seeks the Lord's face. She knows that this is why she is where she is. She sees God's favor, that God has brought her to this moment. And she says, it may cost me my life, but I'm going to be obedient. So we really want to, as we turn a corner with our group, we want to connect ourselves to that. And we want to connect ourselves to that point in the story about God's plan for us in his kingdom and how that's worked out. And it's not that we're, saying, I've got this, or, saying, send somebody else, or any of those reactions that Esther may have had. Our reaction should be the same. It's a plan that's worked out in community and the people of God, and specifically the church. It's worked out in the context of the local church and the context of our church. And it's a plan that's worked by God's strength and not ours. It's not that we are the deliverer. It's not that we are doing the saving. It's just that we are a part of God's plan, and we're trusting that he will do what he said he will do, and he will keep his promises. But all that being said, it is a plan for us. This was a plan uniquely designed for Esther. Mordecai couldn't do it. Nobody else could do it. God had put Esther in this spot, in this place in her life, to carry out the plan of God. And in the same way, God has put us where he has put us, whether that be at our jobs, in the home, around our specific neighborhood, wherever it is, God has put us where he has put us to be a part of his kingdom. And that plan is worked out in community. That plan is worked out by God's strength, but that is a plan for us. And ultimately, our job is to seek his face and to be obedient. And you'll never find a better picture of that than how Esther responds to this crisis. So work those things through with your group and look at how God has a plan for us in his kingdom, and how it's worked out in his community and worked out by his strength. But ultimately, it is a plan that he has for us to serve him.